Great, thanks a lot for the generous introduction. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a project that I'm involved in at the minute, funded by Science Foundation Ireland on building city dashboards, and we're a couple of years into the project, and it comes out of this ERC project. So when we were doing this ERC project on kind of looking at the politics of the smart city, we thought that one way of really getting some in-depth insight as to what actually goes on is to build the technology and get involved in the institutional arrangements of interacting with local authorities and with other stakeholders and finding out what really kind of happens in the negotiation, decision making, and so on. So this is really around kind of smart city technology, and it's around urban big data. So for those of you who are not familiar with what's going on with smart city technology at the minute, this is really the embedding of ICT, networked infrastructure into cities to try and solve a whole series of different problems through technical solutions. So, and it goes across a whole range of different domains. So it could be in government, around e-government systems, city operating systems, some performance management systems, urban dashboards, and so on. So, you know, how government actually operates, through into security and emergency services. So things like centralized control rooms, digital surveillance, predictive policing, coordinated emergency management response, into transport with things like intelligent transport systems, integrated ticketing, smart parking, logistics, transport apps, all kinds of stuff, real-time passenger information you'll be familiar with, into energy with smart grids, smart lighting, through waste, through environment with various kinds of sensor networks, IoT networks, collecting various kinds of information in relation to pollution, noise, weather, and so on, into buildings, building management systems, into homes, what's kind of going on with smart homes and so on, and then into the civic domain, various kinds of open data, volunteered data, data hacks, and so on. And they're producing these kind of streams of urban big data. So this is data that's typically, what I mean by big data, typically I would define in relation to velocity and exhaustivity. So this is data that's streaming relatively quickly, you might be readings every 10 seconds, every minute, and so on. And it tends to be exhaustive in the sense that if it tries to capture the whole domain. In a sense, so like an ANPR camera network is capturing every single car, it's not capturing a sample of cars. Okay, so it's exhaustive in that it's trying to capture the entire population of what's happening within a system. So various forms of urban big data streaming off. So it could be directed, and by directed I mean there's a human in or on the loop, as opposed to a human off the loop. So this is somebody is involved in directing the camera or intervening in the decision making. So it might be CCTV, drones, satellite stuff. Could be public administration records. Into automated forms, so various forms of automated surveillance. Your digital devices, your spy in your pocket, your smartphone, for example. Which at this case is now telling Vodafone where I am every 4 minutes, and any other location-based app on my phone where I am, along with a whole series of other data off the phone. A whole series of sensors, actuators, transponders and meters, so the Internet of Things, and various forms of interactions and transactions across the networks. And then there's the data that we volunteer up. So the top part is really data shadows, it's stuff that's taken from us. This is data footprints, this is the stuff that we give away. So I use the social media and volunteering various forms of information. Might be using wearables, might be crowdsourcing, might be citizen science, and so on. So a whole series of data now being produced, often in real time, and very large exhaustive samples of data. And it's feeding in to the notion of, it's also kind of shifting from single domains into more integrated domains. So typically at the minute we would have domains, so this is a port domain, for example, so this is based around I think Rotterdam port, except for the picture in the top right, but the rest of it's I think Rotterdam, where a whole series of different pieces of data, could be chemical sensors, the thing down here is a chemical sensor, could be a CCTV, it could be RFIDs on the cargo boxes themselves, the ships themselves, the robotic. These are all long had automated vehicles in ports, moving the containers around and so on. The information flowing in to a system. So the data is being used to kind of manage and run So it's being used to control the operations of this kind of environment. And people are trying to move towards that becoming more integrated and sector-wide. So there's a notion of a city operating system. So in the same way we'd have an operating system on here, and I could use it to access Word and PowerPoint and Excel and so on, I would have a city operating system and I could access energy and transport and lighting and waste and whatever, right? So use a kind of an integrated, breaking down the data silos within the organizations and linking the things up. And there's a number of companies who are kind of exploring the space of city operating systems where you can use this kind of data. So IBM's Intelligent Operating System, the middle one is Robotica's City Operating System, this is Living Planet's Urban Operating System, Microsoft City Next, and then Hawaii actually released this yesterday or the day before. It's also the kind of City Intelligent Operating System, principally an IoT network system for managing what's going on across different domains within the city. And then this is leading to this notion of a data-driven urbanism. So principally around operational, decision-making, management kinds of work. So in the top left here is probably the most famous example, the Rio control room, written quite a bit about in the literature. It's a 24/7, 365 days a year operation. It employs 400 analysts. It's pulling the data from 32 city agencies and 12 companies, principally utilities transport companies. And it's pulling it into a single place and then using that to try and manage the city in real time. City workers themselves have devices where if they come across an accident or they come across something, they can upload the data in and they can pull data down when they're, so this was the centre that was effectively put in for the Olympics and the World Cup and the Confederation Cup. This was part of the idea of being able to manage what was going on in the city, built by IBM for them, but actually taken over by the city pretty quickly. This is a centre in a smart city centre in Tokyo for managing a district, and you can see some of the kind of analytics, the dashboarding analytics here. This is a control room for Dublin. This is a traffic control room in Dublin. This is the SCAT system. These are obviously different junctions. It's pulling in data from I think it's 800 inductive loops, 400 cameras, 1,000 buses, social media, all the kinds of things. It's an algorithmic system. It's a human on the loop as opposed to a human off the loop. So are you familiar with the human in, on and off the loop? So the in is basically the algorithm comes to a decision, but it processes the data, but the human makes the decision. The on the loop is the algorithms will make the decisions, but somebody is there overseeing it and they can intervene if they need to intervene. And off the loop is it just works autonomously. It's an automatic, autonomous, automated system. So this is an on the loop system. It's obviously trying to manage, I think it's about 600 different junctions, and so it's doing that in real time. So really, the person sat in front of there is just intervening when things are flagged up, but otherwise it's adjusting the signals. So and it is adjusting them. So I could go through and wait 62 seconds for the lights to change. You could come through 5 minutes after and wait 56 seconds. You can come 5 minutes after that and wait 52 seconds, and it might go back up to 65. So it's constantly trying to readjust the system to keep the traffic flowing through the city based on real-time flow of cars through that system. Okay, so that's basically this notion of algorithmic governance within the smart city. That's an example of that. I don't know if anybody recognises this one. Does anybody recognise this one? This is the Maritime Agency's control room in Southampton. I always try and put a control room in every city. There'll be 5 or 6 control rooms in most cities. There'll be a traffic one, there'll probably be a police emergency services one, and there'll be a bunch of other ones. There's about 7 or 8 of them in Dublin. There's a coordinated emergency response one. The police have a separate one. The utilities do, so electricity does. The telecoms have a big one because they're actually doing the entire country from the control room in Dublin and so on. And then there's a whole series of these kind of different ways that people can kind of make sense of this data and use it to kind of process what's going on. But the big shift here is into effectively real-time management based on present conditions, based on data that's actually happening in the here and the now. Okay. And some of that data is being pushed out and made open through APIs and through open data stores and so on. And so people have started to build dashboards on the top of that, so the public can see some of that data and use that data to make their own decisions about what's going on. So they can see what's happening in the city and so on. So this is the idea of the city dashboard, is to some of that data you want closed and you don't want it out there, but some of it you can push out in kind of anonymous, aggregated and other kinds of forms. And a bunch of cities have started to explore this. And that's basically what the project I'm working on at the minute is looking at. And I'm going to talk about the project a bit later on. But I want to kind of talk around some of the practices and politics of the dashboards first. So the idea of the dashboard is it provides a visual means to organize and interact with the data, and it's effectively acting as a cognitive tool to try and improve whoever's using its span of control over what's often quite voluminous, varied and quickly transitioning data. So you kind of need the visualizations to actually make sense of what's happening, and it kind of allows you to explore the characteristics and the structures of the data set and to interpret kind of trends over time. So most of these dashboards have kind of time series data, it's both spatio-temporal data. So some of it will be maps, some of it is just in graphs and so on, and so on. And the power of these kind of utility of these dashboards are their kind of claims to show in detail and often real time the state of play of cities, to kind of translate this kind of messiness and complexities of cities into rational, detailed, systematic ordered forms of knowledge, and to enable us to know the city as it actually is through objective, trustworthy and factual data. And in some cities they're used in very instrumental ways, and some cities they're used in more policy context ways. So in a few US cities that they're used in a performance management way, and they're used in a very instrumental utilitarian way to manage what's going on. Okay, so the real operational decisions being made on the top of this data, but there's also internal kind of management of staff and of processes. So in places like Atlanta or Baltimore and so on, there's a weekly meeting, the head of each department is pulled in, they're showed their data for the previous week and they're asked to account for it. You know, why are you only collecting 93% of the bins on time? Why aren't you collecting 100? Why haven't you filled these potholes in? Why are these lights not fixed? Why are they? So it's a very kind of, ordered way of using these dashboards, performance management form of it. We tend to use it in Europe much more policy contextual way of one form of data that feeds in with a whole series of other to understand what's happening. What I want to do is kind of unpack, I guess, kind of what's happening with some of these. So I want to bring these kind of city dashboards into conversation with critical data studies, and I want to critically reflect on 6 issues. So the first is around epistemology, the second around scope and access, the third is around veracity and validity, then usability and literacy, use and utility, and then ethics. And I'm going to pose them as a set of questions, and I'm going to suggest that these kind of questions can act as a heuristic, a kind of critical data study set of heuristics for interrogating other kinds of systems. So you can take this and apply it to other kinds of things potentially. So epistemology, the question is around how are insight and value derived from city dashboards. These are systems that very strongly rely on visual analytics, typically adopt a realist epistemology, so the data is seen to be representing the real world in a very literal sense. The urban data they're seen as being effectively neutral, value-free, objective, essential in nature. So what the politics of data coming off a sensor? Is there a politics? Is that not just a factual reading as opposed to something that's political? I'm going to suggest otherwise. And when analysed in similarly objective ways through these kind of visual analytics or various kinds of statistics, they would kind of reveal the truth about the city. This is the way that they're kind of sold by companies. This reveals the truth of what's happening in your city, and you can make operational management decisions based on them. But from a critical data studies perspective, Data are produced, not collected. So there are decisions made about the sensor, how to calibrate it, where to put it. If you're doing sound sensing, where you put the sensor makes a big difference. If you put it in the middle of the park or you put it 2 feet from the road, will make a big difference to what you get back. Okay, so there's a whole politics around some of this stuff. They're not neutral, commonsensical tools. They constitute a socio-technical assemblage. And that's kind of what I'm interested in, as a socio-technical assemblage. And they act as translators and engines rather than mirrors. They don't just reflect the world. They act they produce data that then makes a difference to how the world is enacted. So the data that comes into that traffic control room makes a direct difference to how the traffic is then directed around the city. It's not just reflecting the city, it's actually acting within the city, and it's making a difference to what's actually going on, but it also affects our interpretation. So how I present this data will affect how you interpret it, and I'll give an example of that a bit later on. And they're quite reductive in that they atomize complex contingent relationships, often into very simple variables, and often using proxies and other kinds of things. So they take a complex world and then they try and find a simple way of capturing what's happening about a particular issue and so on. And they decontextualize the city from its history, from its politics, from its governance, from its cultural, social relations, and so on. So you're just presented with this data without any context as to what the policy is in relation to that, what's going on locally, might be protest or a political issue around that. The data is just presented to you and you interpret it outside of that kind of contextualization. So this is not to say that they don't have utility, but it's about thinking about how we frame that utility and think critically about it and account for those kind of policies and practices in how we build them and then how we use them. So that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in these kinds of questions I'm going to go through, how they can be then used, fed back into the design and the building of these kinds of systems, so that this kind of we can kind of reflexively build them, but also people can understand the data produced through them more clearly. So this is a notion of the socio-technical assemblage. This was kind of developed out in the Data Revolution book. So I'm not just interested in the kind of the technical stack of how these things are put together. I'm also interested in how these kinds of things affect what's going on. You know, the systems of thought, the forms of knowledge, the finance, the political economies. Like the finance underpinning our dashboard is very different to. So our finance is coming from a research grant agency. It's not coming from the city, and it's not coming from venture capital. That makes a big difference to what we can do and how we do it and why we're doing it. And so the finance can just be crucial in what you attempt to build and so on. There's a whole series of political economy. There's a whole load of stuff around governmentalities and legalities, organisations and institutions, subjectivities, communities, how the marketplace works and so on. And they all kind of affect what's going on. So the second kind of critique is around scope and access, and it's around kind of how comprehensive and open are city dashboards. So dashboards are principally, in fact almost exclusively, display quantitative data, and they want quantitative data that's collected recurrently. So you don't want a one-off survey. You want data that's regularly sampled, continuously sampled. And you want it regularly, so you don't want the census every 10 years. You want something that's weekly, monthly, quarterly. That's the type of data you want. And obviously there's issues there in that not many data sets are collected that way, big data is collected that way, but public administration data isn't necessarily done that way. And what it means is there's a huge amount of information missing from the dashboard. The only data that can go in here is effectively quantitative data that's on a recurrent basis. So that automatically limits the data that goes in, which automatically limits the field of view and what is communicated to the user of the system. And so it's ignoring all kinds of metaphysical aspects and intangibilities of urban life, right? So all kinds of things around values, opinions, and so on, they're all missing from this. All kinds of stuff around culture and social ideas and philosophy and so on, that's all missing from this. And so there's very significant gaps and silences in the data that is displayed and can be displayed. In terms of openness, there are questions around, is the dashboard open for public viewing? There are a number of these dashboards that are just in the mayor's office, or they're just inside the public administration. They're not necessarily up on a website or more open, or if they're up on a website, it might only be certain parts of the data set, not all of the data set. So we do some work with some local authorities in Ireland where we're managing their data for them. And so I know there's a lot more data so we manage their open part of it and we manage their closed part of it. And I know there's a lot of stuff in there that could go open that isn't. And there's a whole series of politics as to why it's not open and so on. And are the data generated available for reuse? As in, you might be able to see the data on the dashboard, but can you actually get the raw data behind it and go and build your own apps and do your own thing? So that's one of the rules in our dashboard is all the data in it has to be available for anybody else to use it. It's not just display. But some of the tools we build for local authorities just display the data. They don't. Although we've tried to use a process of leveraging out the data. So we normally say to people, we will build this tool for you, but if we do it, it'll have to be open afterwards. There are sometimes reasons why that can't happen, for very good reasons. But more could be done to fix that. So the level of openness varies across administrations and across places. And access to data for building the Dublin Dashboard was a significant issue, and we spent a lot of time going around different departments in organisations and trying to leverage out data. And we went in the first version of the dashboard. We went for a very, very quick build. It was built in, I think, 10 months from when we started to when it was launched, and we wanted to get it out really fast because we wanted to be able to demonstrate that there was no real risk to other departments and to get us the data. And within 2 or 3 weeks, we had departments from 3 or 4 other organisations who kind of said, "Okay, fine, I can understand now what's going on. We'll now release the data." But it was very difficult to get beforehand. And then when you do get the data, there's often loads of issues around data measurement, data formats and media, metadata, data standards, modes of sharing, and so on. And it's often difficult to get that kind of data. You can get stuff in PDFs. You can get all this 5-star open data. A lot of it's at the bottom 2 or 3 stars. You can spend ages trying to. So we've spent some time building APIs for and trying to move them towards JSON files and so on that we can do that kind of stuff. But it's a slow process. To what extent can we trust city dashboards? And this is really a question of veracity and validity. And it's questions around data quality and the validity of the analysis and the interpretation. So there's, within any of these systems, there can be instrument and human error and bias. There's often processes of abstraction, representation, generalization, and calibration going on. So you kind of need to know those kinds of things to be able to interpret the data sensibly. For example, the data being produced are shaped by the technical instruments used, have varying specification and parameters, handling procedures, scientific norms and standards, scientist behavior, organizational processes, and so on. There's a big difference between the quality of data coming off a sensor that costs 10 grand versus one that costs $100. And there's been a lot of work now being done on calibrating. So if you get 3 low quality ones, will it give you as good a reading as one expensive one? And so people are playing around in that kind of space. There's a very nice paper, I think, in that Data as an Oxymoron book, where it kind of says, it looks at a water gauge sensor over 50 years, and it basically says, is the data now the same as the data collected then? We take it as it is, right? But the sensor has changed 10 different times. The person going and getting the data is actually using different procedures to get it and all the rest of it. So is actually the same thing? It's a bit like Trigger's broom, right? He gets in a wall for the broom, but the head and the handles change 30 times each, right? Is it the same broom? It's the same thing around with the data, right? So, and we don't really know some of that stuff. A lot of the smart city data is published without any metadata. So we don't necessarily know the measurement framework. We don't quite know the methodology of how the data is collected. We don't know the sampling frame. We don't know the veracity, the accuracy, the fidelity of the data. We don't know the uncertainty, the bias, the error, the reliability, the calibration, the lineage. You just have to trust us that it's correct, because we can't verify any of that. And we just have to take it on trust that what we're getting through the API is correct. But we know from looking at the data very closely, there's all kinds of noise and all kinds of stuff in there. We do a lot of work around, so we're kind of looking on the data, data quality on both the prevention and the cure side. So we're trying to work with the local authorities to improve their data management processes. But when we get crap data, we're looking at how do you fix it? You know, what procedures you need to put in place to kind of cure what issues there are. And it's quite difficult because we don't have some of this information to be able to sort that out. You don't necessarily, if there's any kind of analytics going on, unless it's again explained, you don't necessarily know what's gone on inside the algorithmic black box. So you don't quite know sometimes necessarily what you're, so unless you make the calculations. So we're doing a lot of stuff now on open geodemographics, for example, where we make the entire methodology as part of open science, and you can see exactly what's going on, and you can go in and tweak the algorithm and do whatever else you want within it. And then there are other issues like modifiable area unit problems, which is effectively a geographical ecological fallacy problem. And we've also just recently started looking at temporal ecological fallacy issues. So issues around if you collect the data every 5 seconds, 10 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes. If you and if you shift that, so if you start the clock now, do you get a different, because the sampling rates change, you know, so do you get any issues? So this is a classic example of a modifiable area unit problem. This is identical data at 3 different scales. The top is a numerator district, sorry, electoral district. It's a numerator area, and this is small area. So this is unemployment. The red is actually above 45% unemployment, and the blue is below 5%. And if you look at this area here, the top 2 maps are basically saying this area is a real problem. Once you get down to a fine granularity, you can see it's not a problem at all. And it's actually just a small area in here that's really, so if you're going to do targeted area policy initiatives trying to address poverty, this is where you need to go. There's no point putting anything in here. Okay, but this issue would mean that you would interpret the data differently just on the basis of what scale the data is presented at. Okay, so and if you're not aware of those kinds of issues, you can misinterpret what's actually happening within the data set. So if you're then making urban policy decisions on some of this data, you need to understand how some of this stuff actually works. How comprehensive and usable are some of these dashboards? So there's a kind of an assumption that if you make the data available to be explored and analysed, that it can be kind of interpreted without specialist skill or knowledge, right? This is a kind of the conceit of data science in a lot of ways. You don't need domain knowledge. If you've got the right analytic tools, you can suddenly become an expert on the health because the data speaks for itself, right? But actually, a lot of these things are quite difficult to interpret. And there's a series of practical issues around navigation of the site, the use of the tools, data analytics, literacy. And what we've found, so we've done quite, I'm going to talk a little bit about this later on, we've done quite a bit of work now with end users. And of course, the biggest problem with the Dublin Dashboard, as it is at the minute, is it loses 90% of people within 5 seconds of landing on the page. The data literacy skills of the general public is actually quite low. So what you think of as a relatively straightforward graph or map, or a relatively straightforward interface, just loses people. Now, some of the proprietary tools we would use, if you're using GIS on a regular basis, it will be entirely intuitive as to what to do. But if you don't, you're just, what do I click on? What do I do? How do I pull the data up? What do I, you know? And some of the Esri tools are useless at that. They lose people straight away. And so we've been doing try a lot of work now at trying to think, how do you actually make these things comprehensible, understandable, interpretable to different types of users? If these are genuinely about communicating this information to everybody in the city, are they fit for purpose? And if they're not, what do you do to try and fix the issue? So we're doing quite a bit of work around this, and obviously it directly affects use and utility. And these are kind of commonish enough visualization tools within some of these dashboards, and they're just too complicated. Use and utility, I've talked a little bit about this. So they're often used in different ways: for monitoring performance, managing urban systems, for contextually understanding, formulating policy, for creating public knowledge, and also producing counter-narratives. So there's an idea that the public should be able to go into this. They can assemble the data that they need to campaign against a particular, I don't know, like a new building going in, or a park being paved over, or whatever it might be. And they can be used tactically, symbolically, or politically. And if the data are open, then there's this notion that they can foster an open data economy. But there's definitely a kind of a politics to how they're deployed. City School, by the way, is part of the way in which Boston communicates some of its information back, and you get these kind of scores. And I went and interviewed the team who produced this, because it's kind of incomprehensible to me. That's what you get, right? You're not told how those scores are calculated or what they mean or whatever, right? You just know that red is bad and white is okay. But technically they really matter. So if you're in red for a quarter, your department will get a visit from the mayor, and you will have to account for why your data. Okay, and this is actually standard deviation data, and in any case, it took me a while to get from them what exactly it was that was going on with inside of this. And I'm somebody who builds dashboards, and it took me a while to get them to explain their dashboard to me, what the methodology behind it was, what the data behind it was, what was used from it, and so on. It's almost incomprehensible to a member of the public. It really doesn't mean a lot. This is a kind of the city start thing. I think this is Baltimore has a purpose-built dashboard room, and this is where they hold their once a week, and they go in and they see their data, and they're asked to account for what's going on. And then there are issues around dashboards used ethically. And in some ways, this is not too bad within the city dashboard space, because most of the data is aggregated, and none of it really is individual level data. So you know how many spaces are in the car park, but you don't know whose cars they are. You know how many, what the sound sensor is, or what the whatever is, right? So, if it's public administration data, it tends to be aggregated data, so you don't necessarily get into some of this. But there are clearly issues around smart city technologies in general, around surveillance and data surveillance, issues around privacy, and it could have privacy stuff. So if you're doing MAC address tracking, and then you're using some of that data into one of these dashboards, although the data you're displaying might be okay, the process behind it might be really problematic, that you're tracking people often without any notice or consent as they go around the city. So the raw data might be a problem as opposed to what's in the dashboard itself. There's an issue around ownership and control. This is also an issue within cities, because they often subcontract out a lot of this service. So it's actually private companies providing some of the technology, and there are real questions around ownership and control of the data and what can be done. So when Dublin did its bike share scheme, they accidentally privatized the data off of that. So when they asked the bike share company to have access to the data, the company just said, no, it's not in the contract, you're not having it. And they only got the data when they expanded the scheme, and on the second contract they negotiated getting access to it. So you couldn't build any apps that showed how many bikes were in the bike stations or not in the bike stations, because the data wasn't available. Okay, so there are questions for local authorities and government departments when they subcontract out this stuff, that they are responsible to their citizens as to what data is collected, how it's collected, who it's shared with, how it's managed, where it's stored, all the rest of it. And often that's just not in the frame of the procurement process. So there's issues there. And then how that data might flow off into data markets. So the data is often a secondary market. So if you've got big belly bins and so on, the primary service is the waste collection, but they also sell the data from the bins back to the local authorities. So that's a data service built on top of the infrastructural service. And then, of course, there are issues then of how that data might be used in social sorting, redlining, geodemographics, how it might feed into things like predictive profiling, predictive policing, anticipatory governance, into kind of nudge apps. There's loads of nudge apps in the smart city space, trying to nudge people to be more energy conscious, or better travelling options, or better whatever it might be. And who gets to decide how people are nudged and in what way? There's a whole politics as to who makes the decision about how people are nudged, who gets to be nudged and how they're nudged. Big issues around data security. So cyber security around some of this data. Do local authority, for example, have computer emergency response teams? What happens if this stuff is hacked? So you can hack infrastructures, anything networked, right, you can hack. There's a whole series of examples of things like traffic lights being hacked, tram systems being hacked. There's a whole load of examples now, this kind of stuff. And then issues around control creep. So control creep is a technology designed for one thing being crept out into another use, basically. Okay, so they're my kind of 6 kind of concerns around the dashboards. And then what we've been trying to do more recently is work those kind of critiques back into our design and implementation of the system that we're in the process of building. It's kind of a fundamental applied project. So we have a bunch of stakeholders, and we're building technology that will be available at the end of the project. There are 4 key work packages around data access quality and standards, around multimodal interaction. So we're trying to take the dashboard off of the screen. I'll talk a bit about that afterwards. A whole series of stuff around data analytics and modeling. So trying to move beyond visual analytics to actually providing more interpretive tools, more statistical tools as to what's going on. And then a whole program around data literacy and outreach, doing things like school packs, doing stuff with community organisations, doing stuff with training with local authorities, and so on. The project is open science, open source, open data. So at the end of the project, all the code will be available. Obviously, all the data is already available behind the system. All the methodology so it's open science in terms of all the methodology, the various algorithms and so on, they'll all be opened up. So in theory, any other city should be able to take this, implement, tweak, drop their own data in, and so on. It's meant to be kind of low cost, low maintenance, but there are issues around staff competency to be able to do this, but that's the theory in any case. Try and inform best practice, specify frameworks, so trying to provide design, things like design guidelines, and so on. We're doing a lighthouse follower model, so we're building it for Dublin, and then we're trying to replicate in Cork. So do we encounter different types of problems in the implementation in Cork that we would get in Dublin? We've already kind of expanded and doing a couple of other little bits and pieces, but they're the 2 main ones. And then the partners are the 4 local authorities in Dublin, the 2 Cork local authorities. So the politics there, even just minor stuff like 2 local authorities who really don't get on with each other, like Cork, like even just getting branding, you can go with red and white, they both agree with red and white, that's their colours, logos, orders, all this kind of stuff. There's loads of stuff goes on there. You can't do one thing for one local authority and not do it for the other one, and then Central Statistics Office, where we're looking at stuff around big data, smart city big data and new official statistics, and stuff with Ordnance Survey Ireland, where we're doing stuff around their new national 3D data set that they're trying to create with their kind of test partner on that. So this was the original Dublin Dashboard, funded through my ELC project and a little top-up grant from SFI. We launched it in 2014. It's still up there. It will probably come down relatively soon, but it's still there. It has about 52 modules in it underneath these top-level modules. So there's a kind of a quick overview thing, like what's happening kind of now. There's How's Dublin Doing, which is a whole series of indicators, so stuff related to transport, employment, health, education, and so on. You can mostly monthly, quarterly kinds of data. There's Dublin Real Time, which is 2 sets of maps, basically, 1 transport, 1 environment. So it has kind of road speed, it has number of spaces in the car parks, it has a kind of a capture from a CCTV cameras, has the bike share, can't remember what else is in there. Has the weather, it has the sound, it has the pollution sensors, has the water level sensors, has a bunch of whatever's there. Dublin Mapped is taking stuff like census data, crime data, public administration, providing a whole series of mapping modules. I think there's about 1,000 variables in there from all different types of places. Dublin Planning is all the land use planning stuff, all the planning permissions, so you can like look at all the planning permissions going back, click on the dot and it'll give you the planning file, tell you what's going on. Dublin Near to Me is basically tell me where all the Garda stations are, tell me where the nearest pharmacy is, tell me it's location-based service stuff. Whole bunch of housing stuff. Dublin Reporting is you can go on and say there's a pothole here, there's a street light out here, there's a whatever, and so you can kind of feed back information the other way. You can go on the data store and get some of the data, and then kind of apps that have been built. So a lot of these stuff hasn't been built by us. So this has partly been built by us and partly collating other people's things. So if they'd done something really well, we didn't bother redoing it. We just pushed people out to them. So people who built apps based on the data we'd got on the dashboard. The Dublin Bay pulls a whole load of maritime data in, including the real-time position of the ships and all that kind of stuff. We did have Dublin Social, and I think we still have it as coming. It's been coming for like 4 years. We did actually build a set of tools, and then we never implemented them. Mainly around kind of ethical questions that we want to kind of work through a bit more, and then we never got around to doing it basically. But I think there's some real ethical questions around using some of the social media data and how we would do that in a way that we were comfortable with. So we kind of parked it. The Cork dashboard, kind of similar kind of process. This is the kind of data actually in both of them. So there's public administration, official statistics, operational, scientific, crowdsourced, location, media, derived data. Again, put together quite quickly to have something up there at the start of the project, and this will basically again disappear. And so what we did in terms of partly redesigning, we kind of looked at some of those questions earlier, but we also, so this is part of the work around kind of the kind of comprehension. So we did some work where we went and interviewed, and we actually did some, I forgot what it's called, kind of protocol analysis. So we basically interviewed people as they used the site and asked them what they were doing, how they're doing, and what they're making sense of it, and so on. And we kind of mapped out the kinds of things that different types of users were, the kinds of problems they were finding. So some people it was around interface, some people it was around interpretation of the data, some people, and then we've designed these 3 personas. And so Josh is our kind of novice user, if you like. Jen is a kind of a kind of intermediate user, might be a policymaker, who's using the data but isn't a data scientist, but has some idea about how to interpret things and so on. And then Jeff is our kind of our power user who is very technically literate, is very statistically literate, and what he would want to do. And what we've been doing is designing in relation to these 3 personas. And we'll often have team meetings where we'll say, well, would Josh understand this? Or would Jane actually get this? Like, what would... And then we've got all this data in behind, and we can kind of go and look at it. And we're in this process of doing an iterative. So as we do the design, we're going to go back round to these people and kind of work out what's going on. And what this has done is it's kind of... and so we're going to have... So we didn't want to end up in a situation where we had 3 dashboards, one for each type of user. So then how do we create one dashboard which would cater for all of them, and how would we direct them through? And and again, this is kind of maps on here, the novice, the end user, professional, advanced, and we've kind of thought a bit about this kind of visual complexity with contextual information. And so for our novice users, we've been exploring the idea of data stories and text support. So rather than just having a graph up, there's a graph up that actually with a bit of text that explains what's going on. And the data stories are almost like newspaper stories with all the data embedded all the way kind of through. And we've been playing around with how we do the data stories, whether they're create one big long timeline or whether we have them as individual chapters that kind of scroll across and so on. But there's an idea which you have to kind of provide an explanatory scaffold to accompany the data visualization rather than just give the data visualization. And then obviously down here we have a a power user who wants a whole series of more interactive, complex visualizations, wants to be able to tweak the stats or the algorithms underneath, wants access to the data, and so on. And this is our kind of a actually we're a bit further on than this, but this is where we were kind of a couple of months ago. So this is kind of the new design. It's actually very dark on the screen for some reason, but so this is kind of a new landing page. Actually, when you hover over, you get a bit more information above and below, and then we've kind of reorganized through this notion of the these kind of themes, tools, tasks, and stories, which kind of maps on to our so the tools are the kind of the power user, the tasks are the kind of the mid-professional user, the stories are the kind of the novice user, and the themes are just you explore by I'm interested in education, I'm interested in transport, I'm interested in whatever it is you're interested in. And you can see how we've started to kind of put in text here to explain what's going on. There's pop-up stuff that explains what's going on as well. You could also drop down and change some of the parameters and alter what's happening. There's also a bunch of tabs across the top that allow you to see, change the time series, change what's happening. So we've done quite a lot of work around time series data and thinking about how you present the time series data and how you can represent that. And then this is the multimodal aspect of it. So part of it is get it off the screen onto a smartphone, so again screen based. But then also could you shift it into a different register altogether? Could you place it into VR and AR? We're just about to buy a 3D architectural model of the city, and we're looking at kind of data projector down or LED lights up from underneath. So it's a much more tangible physical model as opposed to on the screen, and a kind of a tactile way of interacting with this. We're trying to explore the idea of actually using the city itself as the medium for the data. So this is actually bikes and the bike stands in here. This I think is some census data. We've been trying to play around. Can you use the Z-axis in a very different way? So maps are often just X, Y, right? So can you use the Z-axis to maybe put in several variables at once to do other kinds of things? So we're trying to think, are there things you can do with geographic data visualization in 3D that you couldn't do in 2D, as opposed to just move the 2D into 3D? So we're trying to play around with that notion and doing it on different devices. So immersion stuff like so that's the Vive, and I think this is the Oculus, and this is the AR. So this is the HoloLens. So you can see the real world as you can see the model, and you can kind of walk around the model and interact with it. And we have a relatively detailed 3D model of the city, as you can see here. We managed to persuade a surveying company, to give us their data. Very accurate. It's a 15 centimeter resolution on, so basically all the windows and all the columns, everything are where they're meant to be. So it's a very detailed model. And the OSI data that we're dealing with is actually this model took a really long time, like 10-12 years to build. It's hand digitized off of stereoscopic images. The Ordnance Survey are trying to do it by algorithm from aerial LiDAR, and they're having real problems. You end up with inverted roofs and walls wrong way round and all sorts of stuff. So we're playing around with that. And then we've also been doing stuff with artists. So we've run our first kind of data art competition. We had about 27 artists bid to do work with the data. So we give them the data and say, do something more imaginative and interesting than we would do with it, and then just see what kinds of ideas we get back from what's going on. So one built this kind of AR app. This is a kind of a sound visualization app, and then this is kind of a 3D, explore some of the data, and then this is a digital poetry. So as these ships move around, there's a trail of kind of something else behind what's going on, and so on. We just employed, call her a writer in residence, not quite the right thing. It's a kind of creative non-fiction writer who's kind of doing workshops with us and then trying to get us to think about actually the text in the, so part of it's about, so our first workshop with her is about voice. So how do you actually write the pieces of text so they're not so academic that ordinary people will understand what's going on? So we're playing around with using the second voice, for example, rather than a straight academic voice, and playing around with stuff. So we're trying to get into slightly different registers than just an ordinary city dashboard and seeing whether any of them make any difference to anything. Okay, so just to conclude then, urban data is proliferating, as are the ways to make sense and act on those data. And then one way of dealing with that is through city dashboards, to collate, process, visualize, analyze, share that data. They're starting to become more common. They're still relatively rare, but they're starting to become more common. But we're starting to try and think about them as these kind of socio-technical assemblages that are contingent, relational, and contextual, and starting to try and think about how do we create city dashboards that are effective communicating about the city at the same time as heeding our own critique. And so we're kind of taking this kind of critical GIS, radical statistics kind of approach of trying to be reflexive about what we're doing. We're not dismissing the tool out of hand, but we're trying to find ways of communicating some of these issues and dealing with them in the design of the system. So we're kind of advocating reimagining dashboards where you explicitly recognize their inherent politics, practices, and contingencies, and then designing based on kind of user feedback, design principles, openness, and reproducibility. And I'll end there. Thanks.
That's fantastic.
Absolutely.
Just fantastic. Thank you so much. I mean, these things aren't going away, and I think what you demonstrate is both the power of the critique that needs to be made of them, but also the importance of putting our money where our mouth is, really, and doing something practical and demonstrating alternatives. And I'm sure that's really difficult. I'm sure there'll be questions about it, but I think it's great.
Yeah, so we've been doing that. So this quote in smart cities, but we had a workshop, and so I've got really tired of the critique in smart cities, right? So there's a whole bunch of people who critique smart cities, but then don't give any practical advice or policy advice or whatever, right? So, and they're not going away, right? Like none of these technologies are going away, so you have to intervene. And so that's what that edited book was about. It's about saying to the critical people, okay, fine, put your money where your mouth is. What exactly would you do? It's okay critiquing, right? But what are you proposing to practically intervene or politically intervene to actually do something? And also saying to the technologists, you need to listen to this critique, right? Because you're kind of perpetuating this inconvenient truth of this is this kind of realist way of dealing with this and ignoring the critique and trying to find some way of bridging in the middle. And that's basically what our project is about, is trying to, half the people. So there's somebody from humanities, Janine Nagy from media studies, I'm from social science, and then there's a couple of geocomp people. So the team is a very explicit attempt to get us into the same way your Web Science Institute is a way of trying to get that conversation, right?
So I'd like to open up for questions. Let's see a show of hands. We might take a couple of questions at a time. Yeah, I think if we take those first 4 questions. I'm going to ask you to use this because we are recording, so just to be mindful. Can you ask anything scandalous or libelous?
I need to do the same, not give any away corporate secrets or anything.
So thank you very much. I so enjoyed that. Les Carr, Web Science Institute. I have a background myself in trying to build technologies to promote open sharing of information, and then trying to sort of get them taken up and adopted sustainably between organisations and institutions. And so from that background, I'm going to ask you this question. In order to get them adopted, you have to make these technologies just look really impressive to the people who are going to procure them. On the other hand, their job is to do something different, which is to be effective, in your case, making the city better run. How do you think these technologies in general, not just your products, but these technologies are doing in both of those? Are they making cities better, or are they making city governments look better to their national government?
Wow, I'm going to get you to think about that whilst I get the second question.
My name's Richard Axon. I'm a PhD student looking at the epigenomics of human aging, so unrelated to today's topic. My question was, I'm very interested in the data stories component, because the data
Yeah.
stories seemed like a potential like a weak point for some of those critiques you raised earlier, right? There's a certain area that's particularly susceptible to kind of interpretive and political biases. So I'm wondering how you handle that.
They get my politics, basically.
I'm not sure if it's actually on there.
Yes, Jeremy Morley, Chief Scientist at Ordnance Survey, GB, Rhode Island. I suppose my question was, one of the critical things you put in earlier on was about the lack of sort of qualitative information and the sort of subtlety in here. Have you got anywhere or had any thoughts about how to put that more intangible, not data-centric aspects into a system like this?
I think you have the hand up right in front of you.
Not unrelated, actually.
Policy,
Sorry, Hugh Davis, Web and Internet Science. I wondered. You said earlier about like it's not sensible to use the national survey or whatever data that isn't streaming through on a regular basis. But how regular is regular? I mean, it seems to me that some of the things one would like to do, for example, I guess you can measure noise on a regular basis. Southampton has a big problem with noise at the moment. We could measure noise on a regular basis, and that's an easy thing to measure. But citizen happiness, for example, is a thing you can only measure by a survey or something like that, and that therefore will, by its very nature, only happen once every few years or something. But is that not relevant to have that information in your dashboard?
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to kind of see if there's other questions after this round. Has anybody got a question they're burning to ask yet? No? Okay, I'll give you those 4 then as a start, Rob, and we'll see if any more questions come up.
Well, okay, so the first one was...
Do they make them look better, or are they really better?
do the technologies make the city better, or do they just make it look better?
Not just look better. But, it's an actual problem.
Looking better than
Yeah, so, I mean... So the whole smart city market is quite interesting. I mean, so I have another talk called The Adoption Gap in Smart Cities, which is about why they've stalled. And it's partly that the first wave of the technology didn't quite work and live up to the promise of what they were meant to be doing, but they were extremely effective at place promotion and being used in how the city kind of sells itself to its citizens, but sells itself to funding agencies and government departments and so on. So there's a bit of that going on. But some of it is incredibly useful. Like if you were to take the control room for the traffic out of Dublin, it simply wouldn't work, right? It would be gridlocked. I mean, most people in Dublin would probably tell you it's already gridlocked and it's not working, right? But if you took it out, it really would be gridlocked. I went there actually with the government minister. I did a report for the Prime Minister's Office on data security and data privacy, and we launched it in the control room. And he said to the control people, like, does this actually work, right? Like, what? And they said, do you remember last Tuesday and blah 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 was completely gridlocked? So yeah, the system went down. Like that's how we can prove it. When it fails, we know it doesn't work, right? And so. So all of it has utility to varying degrees, and some of it is tied into this kind of place promotion, place marketing, kind of branding. And so smart cities is part of this entrepreneurial urbanism. It is about place competitiveness. It is about marketisation, privatisation, public services. It is about kind of international competitiveness between cities and so on. It's the latest phase. You kind of have the entrepreneurial urbanism, and you creative smart cities, and smart cities follow on from that. That's very, very clear in Dublin. It's actually the same people involved in it all the way through. The same characters appear in each phase of that store, and it's always in the same part of the city. And so they now have a smart district, which before that was the where a lot of the creative city stuff was, and before that was where all of the entrepreneurial planning went in the first phase. It's a special development zone and so on. So it's a bit of a mix. Some of it's a bit smoke and mirrors. Some of it. But people have got very, there's been a bit of kind of pullback because basically the technology is not mature enough. The intelligent transport systems is really mature. That stuff's been going on a really long time. The Dublin one's been there since 1987, and so on. But stuff like the smart lighting stuff is pretty, and also the value stuff is not quite clear. So it's very clear what you do when you change your light bulbs to LED. You save about 65% of your energy, but it's not very clear why you would then stick a whole load of sensors and digital signs and everything else on what the return of investment would be on that, which is why there's no large-scale smart lighting deployment anywhere. There's only test beds. So there's this kind of thing that's still being worked out, and there's at what point do you jump into the market, at what point it might be 50% cheaper in 2 years' time. So it's there's all that kind of stuff going on. There's the thing around the data stories and the politics and interpretation. Yeah, it's because it's basically data journalism. So we've had this conversation, and our workshop next week is about this, about the voice and around the message and around, and so we've been trying to think about that, and it's very difficult around some issues. So so the first data story we did was housing, mainly because I've done a lot of the housing data over the last 10 odd years, all the way through the crisis. It's linked into the crisis. The Irish crash was not a subprime lending crash, it was an oversupply, overdevelopment crash. But we're now in an undersupply in the cities. We have 10,000 people homeless in the country, gone up from 1,000 in like 2 or 3 years. It's very difficult to tell a data story around housing without it being political, right? And it's on everything: mortgage arrears, negative equity, homelessness, rent costs, which are like through the roof, going up 20% a year. It's very difficult just to say, here's the data, you work it out. If you're going to do a data story, so we've been talking about that, and we're trying to work out how to do it.
Seems like there's potential serious downside risk of being perceived
Yeah.
political, and that kind of compromise.
Yeah. And we'll have to have a conversation. We'll have to have the conversation with the local authorities, because they're in charge of housing. So it's, I mean, we've had conversations. I have a paper actually in Geoforum a couple of years ago around the politics involved. So I remember about 2 or 3 weeks before we launched the first Dublin Dashboard, one of the senior execs of the council went, "I'd really like it if we removed this variable." And I was like, "No, you're not removing it, right? It's like that's it." And he was saying, "But it doesn't really make us look great." I was like, "Yeah, it makes you look rubbish now, and in 5 years' time, you're going to look great on it, right? You can't take these things in and out or whatever." And they wanted the first screen where they wanted to put maybe 5 indicators on the landing screen, and then we had a conversation which would be the 5 that would go on. And initially they just said, "Well, you pick them." And I said, "But I could pick 5 on that have all got red arrows going down, right? Or I could pick 5 that got green arrows going up. So I could make you look really good, or I could make you look really bad." You just can't devolve that decision to me to decide. There's a politics, right, in just selecting what goes on the landing page. So the next round will be going back with our data stories to both users, but also to our stakeholders, to say how we, but at the same time, I'm pretty resistant to them being able to just try and push the message that they want to push. Although interestingly, I know the housing person in DCC this is where the web streaming, you want to go off record, right? And in any case, he's a Marxist geographer, and he's quite sympathetic to you telling a particular kind of data story about housing in the city. There was about qualitative. It's very, very difficult to put it into a dashboard. You just have to basically say, we don't have it. I think you just try and be explicit about this is the kind of data we have, and this is the kind of data we don't have. I think it'd be really, really difficult.
Some of the issues of the stories, doesn't it, and how much you can curate the story or contextualise stories.
Yeah, you can
just go with bold data.
Yeah. I mean, you could go off to some of these one-off surveys, and you could kind of get your values and your opinions and your whatever in it, but it's still pretty difficult. And it also depends on the scale. So one of the big problems. So the ISO now has a new city standards, so ISO 37120, and there's 100 indicators that they want every city globally to have, so they can compare cities and so on. And we were asked whether to look at whether Dublin could do the ISO standard. This is slightly off the qualitative thing, but and out of the 100 indicators, we could only provide 11. And part of it was because some of the data was privatised. We couldn't get any energy data. That's all by a private utility company. and so on. And then some of the data was just at the wrong scale. It's at the region scale, or it's at the national scale. So R&D spend in Ireland is done at the national scale. There's no sub-regional breakdown, so you can't provide it. You know, and it's partly the same kind of issue around some of these surveys, right? It's just a time slice as opposed to a spatial slice, and it's the utility around some of that, and there is this notion of which they're trying to let you manage the city in this kind of operational sense. So I think there has to be a sense that it will be repeated, even if it's so there's a lot of census data in ours, but in Ireland it's every 5 years. The census is every 5 years, it's not every 10 years, and 5 years is kind of enough a window. And also there's loads of data in there that's not collected anywhere else. Right. And so we have the sense that if there was a happiness thing and it was done every 5 years, we could do that, other than I think that the happiness stuff is completely bogus science.
Yeah, well, okay.
You know.
It's just an example of
yeah.
something that you would have to collect slowly.
Yeah, it's very interesting. For example, if you compare like the happiness stuff between the north and the south in Ireland, like people in the south are, I think, are generally more happy than people in the north, but their material conditions are almost identical. You know, so there's kind of like it's a kind of you can be kind of cultural attitude kind of stuff going on in there as well. It's like how you self-report stuff. Okay, we won't get into a conversation about measuring happiness, but I'm pretty dubious of it.
I think you can measure happiness on
well-being. I can,
forums.
yeah, well-being. I can kind of go with. I can kind of go with well-being, but I have more problem with happiness.
Do we have time for one more round? So we've got a question here. Yeah, okay, let's try it.
Yeah,
You
sure.
may not have time to answer all, but let's
Yeah, I'll try and be quicker on the answers.
No, I didn't mean that.
You touched on it briefly. You've got a traffic
Yes,
light.
that's right.
Oh, sorry. I'm Andrew. I'm a PhD student.
Oh, sorry, I'd forgotten about the microphone that works in a mysterious way.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I'm a PhD student here.
Yeah.
You touched on it briefly, where you've got a traffic light system.
Yeah.
Gauge, I guess. How do you, given a number, how do you rank that? I guess on your gauge, what colour do you give it without introducing political biases? And
So you have a traffic light on what?
so
Sorry.
if you've got a number, and
Yeah.
you touched on it briefly, where you give it green, red, orange, whatever, how do you decide?
Not real traffic lights, you mean? How do you decide what the
Yeah, yeah.
categories are?
What?
Yeah.
How do you rank that?
Oh, I don't know.
Hi, I'm Sue White from Web and Internet Science. I'm interested in what extent you've been able to use the city dashboard to counter claims by powerful private enterprise interests.
Yeah.
Bring that back to Southampton, we have docks who generate noise pollution and air pollution and who make outrageous claims about the amount of money they bring into the city. So there's real-time data, and it comes back again to the lapse time data as well. And have city dashboards, it's kind of a follow question, enabled you to motivate new data collection initiatives. So some insight from your dynamic data actually giving you the leads to then be able to pursue something in a more kind of considered research manner.
Yeah.
Yes, I was going to go there next because that's
Hi, Kieran O'Hara, Web Science Institute, Irish citizen. You began your talk with 6 kind of critiques of city dashboards, and you ended your talk with a discussion of your methodology of engagement, etc. What's the link between the two? I mean, which of the 6 critiques are you actually addressing, or are you trying to address all 6? And do you get any sense of where you're making progress and where you're not making progress?
Yeah.
Hello, Isabella Hurst from Ordnance Survey as well.
Yeah.
Here. So I understand the smart city as a city where you tackle some problems, and obviously every single city has got different problems.
Yeah.
So for me, city dashboard like that, like the one you're proposing, it's a perfect outcome or perfect way of actually showing those problems and how local authorities actually dealing with this kind of problems. And also for me, it looks like it's a perfect way to, by making it attractive to the normal user, maybe bringing some kind of information from social side, like I don't know, bring maybe events which can be shared through dashboard like this? Have you thought about something like that as well?
Social side.
So this question and this question, and then we'll let Rob make a choice. We don't necessarily expect him to answer them all. No, I know
So,
that all need to go.
Hi, Lisa from Southampton Business Improvement District. So, my question is to find out what success looks like. So, in terms of this project, the Dublin Dashboard, how are you going to measure that the project was successful? So, what do you want to start seeing happening for you to say, yes, this project was a success? It's slightly linked in with the first question.
Okay, good. Run back up.
Success measures.
Goes to you, privilege. Oh, can be a really tricky one, apparently.
A cheeky one.
A cheeky one.
Robin Frew from DSTL. You mentioned about the qualitative information that you sort of backed away from the incorporating social media into the dashboard, in terms of the companies pushing their information out through APIs, and you can get off-the-shelf sentiment analysis tools quite easily. I'm just wondering, seeing as you're amongst friends here, what specific aspects made you back away from that?
Okay, ethics of social media.
The advantage of having 5 or 6 questions, you do have a choice, right?
I'll deal with the last one just because it's in my head, right? So, we would have a problem with off-the-shelf stuff because we're trying to do open science. So we would only do the sentiment if we could publish the algorithm whereby you could see exactly how we're calculating sentiment, and you, if you were a power user, would be able to tweak so our open geodemographics, you get the full, this is how it works, you get the full code and you can go in and you can tweak it round. It's not like off-the-shelf geodemographics where it's a black box. You put your data in, you get an answer out, and you can create your own categorizations, and you can, so it's that kind of thing. So the off-the-shelf sentiment stuff would be a problem for us for a start. The ethical kind of stuff was around people who've shared their data on Twitter or on Instagram or Flickr did not think it was going to end up in a dashboard, right? So in terms of data minimization principles, it just doesn't hold, right? It's being used for a purpose for which it was never generated. So there's issues there at the level of the individual. So it was an individual level data that we were having a problem with, and then we were trying to work out how to aggregate stuff and play around with stuff, and then we just got sidetracked onto something else. We never picked it back up again. And I think there's been a few reports now. I think the Royal Statistical Society had a whole series of like ethical reports around using Twitter data. And so we wanted to go and explore that in a lot more detail before we went down the line, because we are trying to provide kind of principles and guidelines. So there'll be a set of booklets around, if you're going to do kind of time series data, then these are some kind of general kind of principles or rules for how you think about doing that. So time series data we found is quite interesting, because there don't really seem to be any for visualization of real-time data. In the same way there's a whole series of map principles, and you need a scale and a north arrow and you need whatever. That doesn't seem... So we've done like a survey of a whole load of these, and we kind of found, like 15 different ways that people are presenting the same kind of data and so on, and there doesn't seem to be any continuity, and there's all kinds of issues around change blindness and all kinds of stuff. And so we're trying to deal with some of that stuff. What does success look like? Well, on one side of it's whether we've got a whole load of articles, right? Because that's what our Foundation Ireland are kind of looking at. So we're trying to do it on the fundamental and applied side. So, if it continues afterwards and it's funded by the local authority to maintain it, or it's shifted into the local authority and it becomes part of their mainstream services, then that would be a kind of a successful kind of outcome. If it's adopted by other cities, if the design principles are adopted by other cities, and so on. So that's, I guess, their kind of I guess some of our measures of success, I think, probably. Whether the stakeholders seem happy enough, they do at the minute. We don't actually have a route. I thought you were going to ask me a question about sustainability at the start, and that is a question, like what happens when our funding runs out and what goes on with it. Now, as an institute, we have a long history of maintaining projects. So the Aero website which is kind of a dashboard, but for the whole country and north and south, but it's more census level data and public administration data, not real-time data. We've been doing that since 2005, and we just have a whole series of contract work with different local authorities, different government departments, to do some of their data management practices, sort out some of their data. Now, one of the reasons why we got a lot of that work, because it kind of goes back to some of the ordnance survey stuff, is there were no postcodes in Ireland up until a couple of years ago. So none of the data was georeferenced, which means basically none of the data was mapped because nobody knew how to do it. And we knew how to do it, and we had some algorithms that would automatically address the data. And so we got a lot of work working. So the only way government departments could actually see their data map, like the first time that the Department of Social Protection saw where their claimants were, was when we mapped their data for them. They couldn't do it themselves, right? Because there's no postcodes and none of it's georeferenced. So we have a long history of doing that and then doing contract work. And we've already had a whole series of cities onto us. Can you build us a dashboard? And our answer is, if you can come up with an interesting research question, then we can talk, right? But if you just want us to do service contract work, then that's for a consultancy or somebody else to do. And we're providing all the software that those consultancies can go and build their industry on. So that little Aero project's become almost like a little self-contained consultancy unit, so not quite a spin-out company, but it kind of is. So that's how we've been dealing with it, and it might shift from us into under Aero, for example, or it might shift from us and into the local authorities or whatever. BIDS data, by the way, is one of the few data sets that was withdrawn from us. Footfall data. So we had kind of footfall data, and they got worried it'd be used in relation to rates, and so it got pulled from us. So that was kind of an interesting thing where you kind of build the tool and then somebody decides they're going to turn off the data. So it was a private kind of data source that got pulled. We've had other stuff pulled actually. We had health data pulled. We had ambulance data pulled. Mainly because it showed that they'd never hit their target of being where they're meant to be within 20 minutes. So the simplest answer to that is you don't provide the data to people so they can calculate it. Counter mapping. So we haven't done direct work with communities around doing counter mapping. We're about to start a set of work where we're going to go out to communities and try and develop these kind of packs, part of our training data literacy, and I suspect that might come up, and we might start to work with communities as to whether they can actually use this in a particular way. We've kind of got an idea that they can use it, and we do know in some cases that people have used it. They pulled down the data to have a look. We know that some, like MPs or TDs, have got their constituency office to look at the data in their local area to work out what's going on for a debate about unemployment or housing or whatever it might be. But we've no real sense of who is actually using the dashboard or for what purpose. You know, we have our Google Analytics, but that really doesn't tell us anything. So yeah, we kind of need to try and. So we're going to start looking at that next year. We're doing the schools pack. We're doing a community. We're doing schools program, doing community program. There's a local authority one, and there's I can't remember what the fourth one is. And then we have a set of these packs, and then we're also meant to be putting a whole series of kind of like training videos and stuff up. It might well be that we could do like a data story around this is how you could use the data to mobilize to look at whatever, so that might become something like that, for example. Which 6 of those questions we're dealing with? I'd like to think we're dealing with all of them. I think I probably spent most time recently on that kind of usability comprehension thing, working with one of the postdocs around that, and quite a bit around the data quality, data management side of things. I think you also asked a question around kind of motivational, getting the local authorities to do things and so on. It's actually really hard work, and to be perfectly fair to the local authorities, these are local authorities that have been starved of resources for 10 years. I mean, you had a crisis here. We had a proper crisis. My take-home pay is 20% less than it was 10 years ago, right? You know, and it's not going back up anytime soon. Local authorities have lost 35% plus of their staff. There's nobody in a local authority under the age of 30 because they haven't hired anybody in 10 years, right? So they're trying to do more with less, right? and you go in and you say, we want you to completely reorganize what data you're collecting and how you're collecting it and all your practices, and they're just like, give me a break, right? Like, so you have to go in and try and help them do that. It's not that they're completely closed to it, but you just have to recognize that they've been told to do open data and been precisely zero resources to do it. And open data is not free data. There's proper labour involved in this, and if you know, we have talked to some local authorities and they've kind of said, look, this is what it really costs us to do this. They try to work it out, and then they try and work out the cost benefit. If it's costing us X 100,000 euros a year to do this, and we know from the open data site that basically nobody's pulling down the data and doing very much with it, is it actually value for money doing it? This kind of stuff, right? So there are some kind of questions there around how much you can expect them to do outside of any resourcing to do it, basically. But I think that's probably fair to point to point that out. I think that's most of them, isn't it?
I think it is. I should thank you very much, because we've worked Rob extremely hard, not only just now but all day since he's been here. So if you'd just like to join me in saying thank you one more time. Thank you very much.